Ich werde auf Englisch sprechen. I hope it's fine for everybody. My German is awful. I think you will just suffer the early morning. I would like to thank Geisha for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be for the first time at this conference, and thank you for coming here after a long night. Now? Oh, it's better, huh? Yeah. Okay. So, I will jump into the talk and say something about the structure. I will start just by telling you why I started thinking about this idea of naivete. It has to do with the bachelor project, which turned out to be a research project. I will then talk about my own way of working with interactivity, which is based on enaction or enactive theories. And then I will talk about, as announced in my abstract, I will talk about working with people and working with interactive materials. And in the last one, I will bring some of the issues that were now mentioned about interactive sound and also about self-actuated materials. So this bachelor project is called the ARM Coach, and it started with the question, how can an interactive system motivate arm rehabilitation in daily life after stroke? So stroke patients are impaired, usually on one side, and they have very hard time getting back into the daily life. They do exercises only in the hospital environment. And my students wanted to think about motivation. So rather than working with users in terms of what kind of efficiency, what kind of system they need to develop, they first wanted to understand the context and what kind of things would motivate such users to actually engage their impaired arm and what kind of obstacles they have in this. So they jumped into the field research, did qualitative interviews, observation in support groups, therapy observations, and home-based observations where they were spending time with patients at home. Through this field research, then managed to define a number of a kind of 2 dimensions that they wanted to work with, design space, which goes from alone to social interactions and from fun to forced interaction, forced rehabilitation. And they defined these 3 areas or 3 motivational strategies that they wanted to use in their project. So the first one was the urgency, and this is an example of young patients with children who just have to react if a baby is falling. They have to catch them and they have to do something. And this makes them use their impaired side. The other is the idea of reward, so the therapy support. Therapists seem to be much closer to the patient than even family members, because the therapist is the one who can understand the struggle they are going through. And the last one is the personal interests, of course, hobbies, things that they like to do, so it's a very personal motivational strategy. I won't go deep into this. They develop a system which consists of a haptic interface, a bracelet that you can see wear there around the arm, and a kind of application that is bringing together therapist and patient to work at home. So after they developed the project, they continued with patient testing. They made a little prototype, not the finished one, just a kind of, you can see it's quite big there, but they wanted to see how people are going to use this kind of interface in the home setting. And of course they did also the kind of evaluation with therapists, who was a key player in this process. So I'm talking about this because this project, after it was finished and presented at our bachelor exhibition, one of the main neurology researchers in stroke called me and said, can I come tomorrow to your office? And I was very shocked, and I said yes, of course. And he basically said, this is it, like this is what we need, because he works on a clinical research, so he works directly with patients, he understands their needs, and he also works on research. And he thought that these solutions, he basically asked me, how did you come to this? And I said, well, I don't know, you have to ask my students, because what I did is I mentored them, so I kind of talked about methods and the ways of approaching the problem and focusing on motivation. But it is them who came up with the system. And for me, it was then that I started thinking, well, you know, the separation between bachelor, master, and PhD research, where does it make sense, where it doesn't make sense? And it's not, I'm not saying that they are capable of doing a PhD out of this, but it was an interesting situation where an expert in the field of neurology came to us and said, hey, this is it. And we are like, you know, we don't know anything about this field, we just talked with people. So this led to, he's now becoming the head of a new neurology center, which is a kind of private clinic where we're trying to, yeah, Switzerland. The reason is that the main investor, his wife had a stroke, and he actually decided, he saw that the research is very, very at a low level in terms of clinical research. This is not, the whole thing is not a clinic, most of it is actually a hotel, but the big part of it is a clinic, where we are lucky enough to be able to do experiments and research that usually we have to go through very long, painful processes in the hospitals to actually access patients. So it's kind of a very experimental place. It's going to be open next year. And we continued working with them, and we developed, we kind of integrated this idea first of the bracelet, but also thought about an idea of using space as a kind of motivating agent. So like yesterday there was this talk about, looking at the floor, like maybe it's better to raise your head, and this is a very similar situation. We are trying to engage patients to open doors with their arms through interactive systems. So I'm going to move on into my own projects. I mean, this is now also my research project, but it really came from students, and it's quite exciting to me when I don't have to go into other disciplines and justify what I do, but when they see the value of what we do and they recognize it. In my PhD, I talked a lot about the idea of enaction, and for me it's a very important term, so I would like to, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but I would like to talk about this. Enaction has to do with the idea of using your body to acquire knowledge. So this idea of enactive knowledge is coming from child psychology. And it is basically saying that a child develops through the processes of enactive learning, so exploring the world by touching things and putting them in hands and in mouth, and then moves to the eucolic knowledge when he or she learns about images and icons, and then finally into symbolic knowledge through mathematics and language. Of course, this is not happening only in the childhood. Whenever we have to learn some kind of embodied knowledge, like surgery, for example, there is a process of learning that is happening. And also, sure, a lot of you know Francisco Varela and his ideas of cognition as enactment of a world in the mind rather than a representation. So the idea that the world is not a representation in our head, but it's something we are actively engaged with. And this is important for me because this act of doing, for me, has to do with interaction. I think every time we design certain kind of engagement with the world, with other people, with objects, with spaces, we are basically designing an artificial way of learning. And I'm particularly interested in this embodied learning. So this is just an example of event structures research group where people are learning how to walk on the water. I like this quote from Alva Noah because he basically says that what we perceive is determined by what we are ready to do. And I don't know if we are ready to crawl around the world and put stones in our mouth or walk on the water, but I do believe that this kind of approach, an active approach, kind of naive approach of just kind of trying to have a very tacit experience, which is very familiar to all of designers and artists, is becoming more explicit. And we can talk about it. And I think there are certain qualities of it, like, of course, learning by doing, exploring, but also this naivete, which consists of being very childlike, very playful, very curious, and also very important, you will see this later in the last project where I talk about architecture. It is about negotiating rather than imposing design ideas. So, I'm going to talk about now a little bit about people and how we work with people. This is an example of a workshop tool called Seismo. So just to say, like in the first case, it was more about the product. In this case, we work with immigrant kids. This is a project by Hannah Zenk, a master's student. And she developed, we did 10 workshops with immigrant kids in Switzerland and tried to use this workshop tool that she kind of developed through iteration to address questions of identity, and also to try to raise awareness of their own capabilities, because they really feel oppressed and incapable to have any kind of like, how do you say, bright future. Another way, so I'm just showing this as a kind of ways of working that I'm using. Another way for me, and this was actually the first time when I started thinking of my work as research, is doing urban investigations. So this is a public experiment which allows passers-by to transform the soundscape. The overall aim was to facilitate activities of contemplation and play in the city, which is usually based on rapid task-based activities. So there are two parts of the system. There is this kind of listening post called Belludire, which allows people to hear a directional sound, so also very far away sound. It's a parabolic microphone. And there is the other part of the system, which are sonic balls through which you can play back the soundscape. And you can hear some of it here. So if nobody is interacting with them, they call you, they say, hey. And then when you start, they just create some kind of physical sound so that you can engage in spinning these balls, which are also reflective, so there is this kind of like visual collection of the surroundings, not only the sonic one. And then after a while you start hearing messages or sounds that people recorded and left in this auditory archive. So what was important for me in this project is that I tried to use auditory technology or microphone as a kind of as a technology for listening, not for stating something, which is usually the case if you put microphones in public space. And I want to show you how I then deal with kind of collecting information about what has actually happened. So one way is of course to talk to people, and here is some feedback from people who are using this. So you would call this participatory observation. I'm a part of the system, I'm there and I'm talking with them, or listening to what they're saying.
Le vibrazioni, sì. Chiaro, però è come entrare in un'altra dimensione, sentire come non si è mai sentito.
So this kind of technology makes you hear like you're very close to a stranger. So suddenly you're kind of on the shoulder of somebody listening to what they are talking, and of course, this created also a lot of things. I'm not going to go into detail now about privacy in public space. You know, how do you dare capturing my kind of recordings? It's quite easy to use. So this is the other way that I work. Well, here it's very closely recorded, but often I'm kind of hidden. It was loud there. I try to hide the camera or just observe and then do a kind of video ethnography that is direct, so I'm not in the middle of it. And then I try to, through analyzing this video material, I try to develop diagrams or try to understand how this interactive system disturbs or interacts with the existing context that I'm playing this in. So, of course, there are things that I expect, but also things that I would never think would happen, and that's the exciting part of working with it. But this research is really, I would say, quite open. Like, I don't have a specific goal. I know I want to see what is going to happen with this space. I try to use it in different contexts. So this was in Italy, in Paris, and it was in Boston. So seeing how different contexts respond to it. But it's very hard to have any kind of big scientific conclusion. For me, it's more of an inspiration to think about intimacy, privacy, social interaction in public space. My slides are not moving anymore. That's interesting. I think the police has stopped my talk. All right, so I'm going to move now into materials. One of the challenges in teaching interaction design for me was to say what the hell we are working with. You know, what is the material that we are using with each graphic design, with each sound design, with each product design, with each ethnography. But these are all like other fields. So what is interactivity? And this was, for me, a topic I will show you two ways of thinking about that. The first one, in both cases, it's about material as a relationship or material as a behavior. The first case is about sound gesture, so designing sonic gestures. And so here we are talking about, you know, when I'm filling this glass full of water, I cannot dissociate the sound that I'm hearing from the actions that I'm doing and actually make my decisions based on the sound I hear. So I can actually close my eyes and hear how high the level is and I can stop. So this is not, it was not possible for me to start working with like, here are the sounds, here are the movements, let's put them together. I wanted to understand what kind of relationships are behind this. And this is a part of my PhD. I kind of used three different methods to work with this. I was looking at basic design and methods that actually come from people who came before basic design, where they were talking about abstracting from everyday world, so also graphically mainly, reducing visual elements, so real objects into visual elements. And I followed a similar way to define this action sound relationships. I then embarked on a very hard and long experience of doing psychophysical experiments with my colleagues at IRCAM in Paris. It was this kind of science that I think Bill Gaber was talking about, the hard science with very structured methods, and it was a quite actually exciting experience, because at the end they actually changed their way of working, and both of them that work with me are now in design schools. So it was also kind of personal, I think very personal experience. Another way, so I'm just kind of showing you how all of these different ways of working with this material. Another thing, you can hear it, are aesthetic explorations. This is something that comes from Canadian, or a Canadian area would be called recherche création. It's the idea that if you work with a material, you have to aesthetically engage with it without kind of a specific purpose, but you were using this kind of aesthetic experience to generate new kind of concepts, or simply to explore certain topics. Like in this case, again, what does it mean if you have a sound source that is very close to your body when you open it up? So working on a kind of different topics, and here you see myself and Losius in Graz playing with a system where we are activating sound through gesture. So there are like sonic architectures in the space, and we are activating them. And last but not least, participatory methods. I think we heard enough about participation, but I'm just going to mention quickly. In my case, it was not about bringing together clients or users. It was about creating a third space where different disciplines can meet. So this new topic, then it was a new topic of sonic interaction design. I wanted to bring people who are really interested in this from psychology, computer science, design, arts, architecture, and how we can work and think together around this topic. I should also say there is a book that I've been working now since 4 years on called Sonic Interaction Design that is going to come next year out on MIT Press. It's an edited book, so I just wrote an introduction in the chapter, but there are all these different perspectives on the field. This idea also led me into kind of educational area, thinking, okay, how I can explain to design student who doesn't know how to program, what am I talking about? So I developed this voice gesture sketching tool, which I will play a video of now. So I think Yay! So she's using her voice and coupling it to a movement. So you use voice very often when you want to sketch sonic ideas, but how do you couple it to sound? What I did here is you can record the gesture and the sound and the voice together, so you can experiment with trying different sonic ideas, and you really have it in your hand, so it's embodied in the object. Okay, this is the last part of the presentation, and it has to do a little bit with my personal history. I come from architecture, and I studied architecture in Venice, which is a quite theoretical place to study architecture, so very much more focused on space rather than on the idea of constructing a building. But I went through this process of, well, here it's quite linearly represented, but I'm sure you know it's happening all in parallel. But in the early 90s, we were dealing with the issue of how can we generate form through digital technologies, through computer. And this generative process was something where very often architects were kind of coming up with ideas from philosophy. You had collaborations between Derrida and Eisenman, Deleuze, of course, and all of these philosophical ideas that kind of were transferred into the form, or I would say imposed onto the form. So it's kind of a process of having an idea and then, okay, I want to see how I can generate what I would like to do. The second kind of phase, it was the phase of digital fabrication. So okay, then we got all these machines, we can take this form, we can print it out, we can make something out of it. And finally, the physical computing, where we start working with sensors in the space, and then now what I'm going to talk about, the idea of sculpting matter or working with material itself. What interests me personally in this story is the notion of movement. How this idea of movement, morphing, has gone across these fields. And I'm going to tell you this through my personal kind of story or path. So I used to work for 5 years as an architect on large-scale public buildings like Fiera di Milano or Olympic Stadium in Torino. So very much competition-based projects where I would never see what I did. So it was like sitting in front of the computer, you know, making it cool enough for the client, winning the competition, and then going to the next one. And this was really not my idea of working with space because I could not learn anything. I just learned how to sell. And I wanted to also work on the concept of space. So at the same time, I was doing what I mentioned before, what everybody was doing, like playing with digital technologies and reading a lot of theories and seeing how they play together. What was very frustrating for me in working in this way was that, this was from my diploma work in Venice, was that working with morphing always had to end up in a moment of freezing the form, of deciding, okay, now stop, now this is it, I'm gonna go for it, it satisfies my whatever. And also another thing that I was questioning was, is this really different from organic architecture that we see in the 60s? I mean, at the end, if I make these things out of clay, a model out of clay, it doesn't look much different from Infinity House. And so I was wondering, is it really the process that we are working with? Is it the technique of then producing this thing? What is it that makes it new? But it was quite unsatisfactory for me because I thought that the idea of movement and the idea of something morphing in the space was happening only during the design process. And that's why I went to interaction design. I wanted to see what is actually morphing in the space. And I kind of think it's actually us. It's our sensory experience, it's our social experience of public space. It's the way that we use and move through the space. So this idea of social and sensorial ecologies is what moved then my work from there, because I saw it as a way of designing space. So even if here you don't see any kind of architecture, you just see balloons, there is actually an invisible landscape of sounding objects above their heads that they are revealing with this balloon. So formally, you know, if you look at it, it's not there, but if you experience it, you are in the space. And this is also architecture for me. So just some of the pictures. So what is happening here is kind of collaging things. I mean, the act of design here is kind of putting things together. And you buy, I don't know, a helmet, a hammer, a balloon, you program it, but it's kind of collaging things together. And I was kind of missing this process of really being creative. I mean, I did enjoy working with those digital forms and curves, and really also affected the way I was thinking and my notions of space. So I started wondering, well, how can I get back to this process of really working as a designer, not just in terms of collage, but also in terms of form. So now this is a methodology less part, I would say. This is where I don't have a plan, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this, but this is what I'm doing right now, so I wanted to show it to you. So since about 2 years, I have been working with self-actuated materials. So these are things like electroluminescent materials which are self-illuminated, or electroactive polymers which can change shape, or sound foil, which is sounding. Oops, excuse me. So it's a piece of foil that you can cut in any shape, and then you ground it and you can use it as a speaker. So we do this hands-on. We kind of start from really designing the material on a chemical level. We print things. Here you can see the process of screen printing the EL modules. And here we are in a lab at EMPA, which is a research agency in Switzerland working with materials. And we kind of collaborate with these scientists, or I would say they're kind of giving us their knowledge, and we are then transforming it into something else, and I will show you what we do. So while the scientists are focusing on ideas of efficiency and methods of productions of these kind of materials, they're not using them in this way. They make stack actuators, so we are kind of putting it in a different context but also different form. And here you see some of the modules that we developed in a workshop. So from the perspective also of kinetic architecture, I kind of finally feel satisfied about the movement, because I was not very pleased with all this machinic, motor-driven kinds of movement, and here I think you have a very organic kind of behavior. And what is interesting is that when you actually cut this frame, you are designing the behavior of this thing, because the way that it's going to move, the way it's going to behave depends on the way that you shape the material. Yeah, so as you can see, it can look very organic, and actually the challenge is how do you make it not look like an animal or a tree. But here is the range. So there are different topics coming out of this. This is why I'm saying it's kind of all around the place. It's messy. This is, for example, a project that my master's student is working on now on idea of decay. So this is a banana leaf, which looked like this when he printed. This is thermochromic ink, and then he's looking at the notions of the natural decay, and then how he can play with interactivity in that context. So there are very different topics coming up, and as I said, for me, I will just show you some more videos. This is from a workshop we did last summer or something. Yeah. So we are now trying to just play with it, think about what kind of scenarios we can imagine, what kind of context for these kinds of materials in architecture, not necessarily extremely applied, but there are also things like, which came up also in discussion with scientists, like air conditioning, which is usually very directional, how you can use this maybe aesthetic elements to distribute air through the space. So right now it's very broad, and I don't really have a kind of methodology to work with it, but I do know that for me it has to do with this process, creative process, and thinking about how does this way of crafting affect the way that I think space and think interactivity, because it's really an extreme situation when you move from sitting, computing form, programming things, imposing it onto the form or onto the space, rather than having a material in your hands that is breaking, that you have to work with. So it's really for me about also becoming humble or becoming naive in relationship to these materials. So that's the last project, and I wanted to close with a quote, and also with the Ludwig Wittgenstein example of design, which for me is a very nice example, because as you probably know, after he designed his sister's house, he kind of changed the way he thought about his philosophy, and wrote philosophical investigations, which were quite different from what he spoke about earlier. And I think this idea, what moves as a body returns as a movement of thought, is very interesting because it brings together a more theoretical approaches to the practical approaches, and acknowledging that theory is not something abstract, but is something that is embedded in the experience. And I think that for me it holds a kind of promise of working closer or working in a new way, where practice-based PhD and theory-based PhD are becoming really one. So this is kind of also my personal hope for the future. So I just want to thank to all of the people who are involved in these projects, and thank you.